we'll be on our way. So thank you, everybody who has decided to come to the talk today by Monika Kuffer.
Here's what I found on the web.
On invisible spaces and global urban data maps, machine learning, Earth observation, and deprived urban areas. Monika is a human geographer working as an assistant professor at ITC in the University of Twente. Her research focuses on urban remote sensing, in particular the monitoring of deprived areas like slums and informal settlements. Today, the presentation will it lasts for an hour, so we'll have probably about 30 to 40 minutes of talk and some questions. I encourage all attendees to please use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to submit questions either during the talk or at the end of the talk, so that there's a nice and robust discussion at the close. Possibly raising the question right when you have it may yield the best results, because then it'll be recorded when you have it. So without too much further ado, we will let Monika do a presentation.
Good. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen now all right. Great, thanks. So welcome and very happy and thanks for inviting me to talk about the work I'm doing. And what I'm presenting today is work we are doing on bringing data to places where we have typically not much data on. You could also make a similar focus on rural area. Our focus is very much on urban spaces, and particularly what I call deprived urban spaces. What means deprived urban spaces? That's something you see already as a visual help on the right side, where you see a well-planned neighborhood of high-rise houses, well-serviced, in principle good built-up infrastructure, etc., as compared to a deprived and very congested urban space on the left. I'll talk about what we know about such spaces and why we observe on a global but also on a local level major data gaps, and how I think, or we think, machine learning and Earth observation can contribute to at least closing partially these data gaps. I'm talking about we. I should have put many names on this title slide of colleagues I'm collaborating in this major 3 projects, which is Idea Map, Account, and SLUM Map. But throughout the slides, you will see this projects coming back, and then also referring it to work I'm doing collaboratively with people. I put some sources for those who want to look into some more details about the work. Good. Let me see my slides. Sorry, yes. Good. What I will talk about, I clustered it into 4 major blocks. So the first block is very much introducing what urban deprivation is about, what area level deprivation means, as in contrast to household level deprivation, which normally you refer to slum households. And why we very much focus on area level deprivation. Second, we'll be looking to the existing data gaps. And I also make a short excursion to how it relates to something we are all facing in the moment, the COVID-19 situation, but how it's also different in deprived urban spaces, in particularly focusing on the global south. And then what is the role of Earth observation in combination with machine learning to close at least partially data gaps we observe, but also then coming to several challenges, and then ending with one of the challenges we also see in the generation, but also in the dissemination of data on deprived urban spaces, on mapping ethics and how data should be made available to a larger audience. So first, starting what is the dilemma and how to deprive urban space, how to define urban spaces and deprived urban spaces. What you can see globally, you can observe that the estimated population increase, the majority, 90%, will occur in low, mid-income cities, And most of this growth will occur in spaces, as you see on the right side, Kibera SLUM in Nairobi, Kenya, which is a very densely built up environment of poor housing quality, of being poorly serviced, having households mainly not any basic infrastructure, services, etc. Also very poor living and environmental conditions. Observing some images, and that's a fantastic website of Johnny Miller, who is flying drone images across the boundaries of deprived and the well-serviced areas. And what you see in this example, it's also the city of Nairobi in Kenya. You see a very clear-cut boundary between a nicely developed formal area and a deprived urban area. But things are not always that simple if you look to the complexity of urban spaces. This shows 4 examples. So you see in the example RA, a slum household located in a deprived area, which is a relatively simple example, as in contrast to D, where you have a non-slum household located in a non-deprived, formal, nicely planned urban area. But you also have more complex example, like the example of C, where you have a slum household on top of a roof of a non-deprived formal area, as well as you also have situation of deprived areas. What we see if you compare the typical household level deprivation indicators reflected very much on the UN Habitat indicators, you see the poverty risk of a household relating to access to services, etc. While we then overlook other dimensions people living in deprived area face, which are more relating to area level deprivation, which adds on top of the household level deprivation. Such area level deprivation are very much, for example, related to the environmental risk of an area, like being located in a flood zone, industrial hazards, related to the whole neighborhood being of an unplanned nature, having very crowded, not having sufficient open spaces, not having spaces for kids to play, for adults to interact, but also aspects of social risk, contamination. I'll later show examples also in the COVID-19, with the focus on COVID-19 situation, that trash piles are more and more accumulating in lockdown regimes. So this all contributes to an area level risk of deprivation. I was going through some of the slides, giving example of typically area level deprivation, which for example refers to environmental conditions. Here an example of urban heat and how poor area are typically affected by much more higher surface temperature, which is referred to local urban heat island effects, as well as also to the absence of nighttime lights. In the global north, we are typically worried about health and environmental conditions and effect of having too much city night lights. But inhabitants of deprived urban spaces typically don't have night lights, which is a big issue, particularly also for women and children after sunset, because it reduces a lot on the availability to be outside, but also on particularly relating to safety issues. Another aspect is also the nature of unplannedness, of environmental conditions. We had before somebody joining from Nigeria, that's the Lagos in Nigeria, and we'll use also some other examples of Lagos, where a large part of the deprived urban areas is built into the lagoon, where you have, of course, a lot of conditions, also environmental conditions, also the effect of poor housing conditions, but also the link to land rights, and that's some work and in contact with a local community-based organization, Justice and Empowerment, which are also collecting, archiving cases of land of evictions, which you see on the lower right, an example. Also observed, and that's work from colleagues of mine from the African Population and Health Research Center, looking into the difference of life expectancy of children living in slums as compared to rural and urban areas. And you see a dramatic difference in life expectancy, which also relates to access to facilities, but of course also the general urban deprivation conditions and living conditions children face in such areas. So now, understanding a bit about the context of deprivation, what are the local and global data gaps we observe in such areas? In general, when we look to global statistics, we observe, and that's throughout statistics, that it's a perceived global decline of the slum population. Even so, UN Habitat recognized in a new publication that there's a slight increase again after quite a long period of declining. You see a regional distribution of the deprived population, but this data come with very high uncertainties. And I give you some example where we observe, at least at a local level, high uncertainties. Such data are typically either modeled or nationally reported data. In the national reported data, you might also, depending from where it comes, observe some political influence in what is reported. Taking now one example, which is the city of Mumbai in India. And you see here, I don't know whether you can see it well on my screen, one of the wards of Mumbai, which is the Ravi ward, which is estimated or recorded in the census with about 450,000 inhabitants. However, within this ward, you see the Ravi slum, one of the most famous and biggest slums, is located. And that's estimated locally with about 800,000 to 1 million inhabitants. And you wonder how this fits together, these two data. Obviously, there's a huge underreporting in the census data. And that's something which we see across many Indian cities. And that's also why you might question whether what you see on a national level, this decline, which is expressed by this blue line of a declining slum population in India, what are the degrees of uncertainty in the degree of the decline and whether it's a real decline. And in the context of climate change, what we also observe is that many of these deprived urban areas are located in the high-risk zone, like very close, in this case, very much at low-lying areas. Another example, so now on a city scale, where we see underreporting of areas. That's the example of Bangalore in India, where the local slum board accounts for about 600 slum, and we did a local survey and we found more than double the amount of slums in the city. And typically such areas, and that's all the blue spots, are the areas which are not accounted, which we also term as the invisible spaces, the spaces not accounted for in official statistics. And many of the spaces refer to temporary spaces, as you see in this image of this plastic tents, often inhabited by construction workers. They have very high dynamics, so these spaces occur in the context of a construction site, disappear when the construction is finished, and in some cases, in this example, reappear when people move into their houses and require domestic services. Another example on an African city, sub-Saharan African city, the city of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where we compared bottom-up with top-down population estimates and made a first experiment, which still needs some validation, where we combined for the bottom-up estimate data from Slum Dweller International with a local household survey we did, and adding some VGI data, and simply comparing what you would get as a result if you compare the census-based population estimate of deprived population with a bottom-up, and we come to a difference of 2 million for one city. Why such data are really needed also on a global scale, that's a work we did together with UN Habitat, where we were trying to define the global hotspots of urban poor facing the risk of climate change, and also in the context of developing strategy for climate resilience. And we faced this enormous data gap, so we were not able to easily identify the location of urban poor because there are no global data easily available. What you typically see, and that's again the example of Mumbai, and if you look to the lower left corner, is that the urban slums are typically located at the very low-lying areas as compared of the rest of the city. Why is it important to have realistic data on deprived area? It has many applications in the field of urban health, disaster response, for general planning, for developing, for strategic planning, but also, and that's the coming slides on in the context of COVID-19, where we observe that the typical environmental conditions are not very much easy for inhabitants to follow the general health advices to protect themselves against COVID-19. I just displayed here the list of the advices, and out of this list of advices, the ones which are relatively maybe to follow in a deprived condition. And you see also the morphology up from deprived area in Brazil as compared to a deprived area in Nairobi, is that you possibly, if you have access to masks, you can wear them, but you also saw the picture before was a photo from a colleague from Nairobi of people not easily getting access to masks, and to have this advice not to touch your eyes and nose, etc. Why data is very much needed. That's also in collaboration with colleagues from Nigeria in Lagos, where you also see that a large part of the urban dweller in Nigeria live in slum conditions and deprived conditions. And they have been developing a fantastic archive of corona diaries, of simply mapping and letting people speak on maps about their experience. Why do they do this? Because base data are simply also not available to manage and to cause awareness about the amount, the needs of inhabitants and the conditions in different areas, because base data are simply not available. That's some results of a survey done by a colleague and friend from Nairobi in Kibera, documenting this situation in the context of the lockdown and the increasing food shortage and economic severity of inhabitants faced. Where also base information is really urgent needed. And what they documented is an enormous amount of loss of job, food shortage, particularly for single mother families, increasing crime, etc. What you see, and that has to do very much also with a very particular morphology, the high density. It's a work we did together with colleagues from Brazil. And if you observe this black line, which is not continued because of data issues, but they have been mapping the dramatic increase. What you see whenever COVID-19 enters a deprived community, the increase is much larger and jumps up much higher as compared to general urban areas, which are less congested and where people are much easier to follow the distancing, etc. advices of COVID-19 strategies. In assessing the user needs, within one of the projects I'm involved with SLUM, we are looking into an understanding what are actually different user needs at different levels. And we have been starting a survey. I have in the end also the link to the survey for those who are interested. It would be great if you would fill it in. And what we see is that typically a large part of the data, so we see on a global level, huge data gaps. On the local level, we have a very rich data set often generated, but most of the data are generated with relatively traditional methods, which are difficult to be scaled. And we need But on the other hand, we also observe that typically data are needed at a very high temporal granularity, meaning the dynamics are so fast that data are needed in average every year to have an updated data set about the situation of deprived urban areas. So what is now machine learning in Earth observation can contribute to it? It has a huge potential to contribute, but I think in principle, as being part of this community, we still have many challenges to overcome, and which also has to do that we need to produce data which is useful data and really data fulfilling user needs. In this direction of producing such data, major challenges relate to scalability of data sets. I will go into examples of all these issues. Transferability of methods, really under clear understanding of the local context, working with local data, having also then later local data for validation. And going also beyond the physical characteristics, seeing deprivation not as a binary phenomena, but as a continuous phenomena, and looking into privacy, data privacy and data ethics. What can you see on images from space? So typically, as compared to the ground, which is of course the much richer information you get, ground-based information, but from space you can see typically this 3 dimension, which is put into or modeled as a SLUM ontology. On an object level, you see typically that buildings are small in size. You see different maybe roofing materials. You have specific settlement characteristics which relate to the urban morphology, to be congested environments, irregularity, and you have specific environmental conditions, maybe be it at the slope or also in Nairobi, what we observe that slums are often located in the valleys where you have typically flood and rainwater accumulating. In terms of scalability, one of the big bottlenecks, and that's also coming from a lot of the work we are producing as Earth observation community, is the challenge of scalability. That's some example of work we did in Indonesia, where also the Indonesian government is has been doing a national slum mapping campaign, doing it based on ground data, and they were a bit reluctant to use Earth observation data, because what we also see typically, the data we produce are data which are maybe on a settlement level, part of the city. We use typically very high resolution sensors, which are very costly image data sources. And we don't look into really the development of scalable and low cost methods. Also, we are not sufficiently really looking into this transferability, be it the spatial transferability across cities, countries, the sensor across different sensor systems, as well as the temporal transferability. As you have been seen also on some of the previous slides, that the temporal granularity of information for slums is very high required. Also, the example shows that within few months, an area can change quite dramatically. That's again an example of Bangalore in India. And we need very regular information. But we also need to develop methods which are able to capture this very rapid transitions. We need also to use for the modeling of machine learning, for deep learning methods, we really need to train the data with ground truth information. What I can often observe in the Earth observation community, that models are trained based on image generated information, but not going on the ground and verifying it also with local communities. That's an example of the city of Ahmedabad, India, where we see that the morphology of a historic center might be quite similar to the morphology of a deprived area, and therefore ground truth data is really fundamental. About the challenge to go beyond only modeling physical characteristic and also seeing deprivation or in general socioeconomic conditions as a continuous phenomena and departing from the slum versus non-slum and deprived versus non-deprived binary vision. That's some work we did also on the city of Bangalore, where we could predict the degree of deprivation between different areas in Bangalore, deprived areas, using deep learning. And you see the range of the deprivation in these images ranging from the most deprived area in red color, which are the, typically temporary settlements, to an upgraded slum, which is in green color. But also to extend these methods, not only to focusing purely on deprived urban spaces, but also taking the city as a whole and modeling the socioeconomic conditions of the city as a whole, from the least deprived to the most deprived socioeconomic condition. That's some work we are presently, it's under construction, to be honest. Then also there's a big challenge about how do we validate results. We typically calculate our accuracy, our F1 score, etc. And often the reference data are again generated purely on images without ground data. And that's two examples to show how ground data can be wrong, how this type of visual image interpretation can be wrong. That's an example of a visual image interpretation in the yellow boundary, and showing that actually the machine learning sometimes can detect small clusters which have been omitted by the visual image interpreter. But also the dilemma and the complexity, that's Jakarta in Indonesia. And what you see is that we asked 5 local experts to delineate deprived areas, and there was very poor agreement, which has also to do with the local complexity, but also with different understanding what means deprived. And using such reference data as for validation brings, of course, a lot of complexity and uncertainty. What we're working presently on within SLUM is the development of an open source and free framework. On one hand, on the localization and extension of slums, as well as the more detailed characterization of the physical environment, very much focusing to trying to develop low-cost systems, looking to transferability and also to user needs questions. One important question also in terms of privacy, ethics, but also usage and processing costs is the aggregation level. And this shows various levels of aggregation, and we in the moment experimenting with the street blocks, which are defined by the road network, and a very simple grid-based aggregation level, and comparing different low-cost to free sensor systems for the mapping. How does the workflow look like? So we start with an image, we start with local training data. We generate a basic land cover map, providing basic land cover classes. These land cover classes are aggregated to a land use map, using, in this case, the street blocks, and then classified the different street blocks into land use classes, which are, in this example, still having a binary output in terms of unplanned, deprived conditions. But we are presently working also on the city, that's the example again of the city of Nairobi in Kenya, working with gridded mapping systems, using a relatively standard random forest classifier and looking to the development of the probability of a grid cell being deprived. That's one of the largest slums in Nairobi, Kibera slum. And investigating the differences between the high cost data or the low cost images, which is at a slightly coarser resolution, and the free cost data, which is at a resolution of 10 meters for Sentinel-2 and a radar system. Combining the free cost data, the Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-2 data, which are free to be downloaded within the Copernicus program, we are able to produce city-level maps of deprived areas. This, again, the city of Nairobi. But also predicting the probability of a grid cell. So behind is this gridded system of a grid cell being deprived. But also looking to the local characteristics, the morphology, the physical conditions, the environmental conditions. We are going to the characterization of slums, looking into the urban morphology. So how much can we extract about the building morphology in high resolution data, but also looking into the question of can we use actually free open high resolution data, in this case an experiment done with Google Earth images. Can we download Google Earth images, can we train them on existing available free open training data sets and predicting the build-up morphology over the city of Nairobi. And one final example of this local characterization has to do with the trash piles and the accumulation of trash piles, in particular in the context of COVID-19, and the usage of very high resolution systems to really map the locations and maybe also the dynamics of trash piles in deprived urban areas. A final excursion towards the mapping ethics and how can we deal with the dilemma we have to provide data, how to validate data, and to share it with a larger public. What we can observe is that high resolution systems are getting even more higher and drone images providing a lot of detail. And the question is, what shall we actually make publicly available? Where do we actually have to have really some privacy concerns? Also relating it to the question, how much do we actually support local communities in the case of protecting them with the generated data, which also build, of course, a historic evidence, which can be often used also in court cases against illegal eviction, but also can be endanger local communities, that evictions like recently happening, an illegal eviction happened in Nairobi, which also was actually banned by the court, but still happened. So could we as data scientists maybe contribute to such things happening? Also a big warning from a colleague from a community-based organization, one of the community leaders, Nisera, I'm working together with, this frustration about communities saying we data scientists come to communities, we take data, but we never give data back. So they never see results coming back. And then also when we think about data scientists, when we produce data, what resolution is really necessary? Do we need to also, how can we communicate also the uncertainties of data? Of course, each map produced by a machine learning algorithm has a certain accuracy. Labels and classes of areas might be wrong. How can we communicate that there's only a certain level of accuracy, certainty about our labels? So how can we make such data publicly available? These are one of the major, or some of the major data challenges to be solved. What we're thinking about are in the moment to have data not being shared at the highest level of detail. We are doing presently a lot of work with gridded systems because we feel this is not giving exact boundaries and maybe also not stigmatizing areas, also not having this binary slum, non-slum, deprived, non-deprived label, but simply degrees of deprivation within a gridded system. And that's what we are presently building up in a larger network of bringing together local communities, community representatives, data scientists in the development of a data ecosystem, which is interacting between the locally built data and the Earth observation machine learning data, and trying to build data layers which are of benefit for local communities, but also being of benefit for global data needs on urban deprivation. Some final thoughts is that what we observe that in principle, for many SDGs and urban SDG indicators, in particular the spatial dimension is missing, and that Earth observation has this potential to bring the spatial dimension to this SDG indicators. But we need to produce as Earth observation community much better data at scale and data which are responding to user needs. We need to really model deprivation at using local data, having this interaction with local communities, but also producing them at possibly aggregated scale to protect local communities. We need to communicate much better uncertainties inherent in the data layers produced. And what we have been observing in the first months of COVID-19 outbreak, that there was a huge data need on urban deprived areas, but there was no base data available to respond to this urgent data needs. And therefore, we really need this combination of community-based data with Earth observation data. And for those who are into data and working with data on deprivation, I would be grateful if you could fill in this user needs survey. And then I think I'm already much over time. Sorry for this hiccup. And I close my talk. I have a small, yes. Thanks a lot. So I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think I'll go, some people have voted on them, and I'll go in order from most to least. I'll read them out for the recording, which, to answer one of the questions already, there will be a recording posted to the Spatial Analytics and Data channel. I will put that in the chat shortly after I'm done asking this question. So the first question that we have comes from Daniel Arabispel, and it's, what is the role, if any, of the data from the developed world to make us better, to help us make better sense of the reality of the developing world? That is, do you think we can use what we know and what we're learning about the world through developed countries, such as good censuses, comprehensive geodatabases, etc.? Can we use that stuff to learn more about the developing world? And conversely, what do you think we can learn about the developed world from the type of analysis you've presented here?
That's a good question, and I think I don't have, being frank, I don't have a complete answer. But I think we need to have much more this interaction, and also to leave this idea. Myself working for ITC, and there we have been having this interaction because we have been established in a context of development cooperation, and to have much less this idea that we do capacity development, but more to have this co-design and co-creation approach, and not thinking that that we have the ultimate truth in the global north, and we have to just take our knowledge to the south and it will work. And that typically doesn't work. And we need to learn also much more how people are managing and finding very creative solutions in the south from where we really can learn from in the north. I think we have to much more interact and generate common knowledge and learn from each other on an equal level, on an equal base. So that's very much. In terms of training, and very much in a techie way, I was very much impressed by the work of a colleague of mine who showed this example of the mapping of the footprints using Google Earth images. And basically this is using training data coming not from the global south necessarily, but also coming using training data from the global north. And it's simply a huge data repository, which is built from a Chinese university, which covers images of all the globe. And it worked really well in training to depict the building footprints in Nairobi in Kenya. So I think, which I found an impressive example how global knowledge can be used for solving a local problem. I'm not sure if I answered the question complete, but I think it's more like this. I think for me, the dialogue and linking and learning together, yes.
So the co-production of knowledge is kind of...
Yes.
Cool, thank you very much. I think that's great. A second question posed by Sean Fox is that his group has been working with OpenStreetMap data to segment the city of Karachi into organic units, but they found this data to be very noisy. How have you dealt with that kind of noise in volunteer geographic information when analyzing the morphology of the cities that you've studied?
Indeed, basically, if you take like data repositories like OpenStreetMap for most cities, they are typically totally incomplete, and typically for the deprived urban area is capturing much less as for the formal city. They are noisy. The generation of training data, so you need to do a lot of manual labor, and that was actually also this cool example which we found recently. Like, we did two experiments on the city of Nairobi. One is really taking training data, local training data from Nairobi, and investing a lot of manual labor. Thanks to a PhD student I'm collaborating with, Angela. She spent hours in cleaning up data and then using them as training data, while my colleague simply used this global database, which is not from Nairobi, but was able to train on a clean database the city of Nairobi, and producing quite good and impressive results. But indeed, there is a lot of noise, and that's a big problem also when you work with VGI data, that you always need to clean, to triangulate with other data to have to increase your level of certainty.
Cool, thanks. We have a question from Victor as well in the chat. So he's asking about the drone imaging that you mentioned for data collection in slums. And he wants a little bit more information about how that might work. Are they used in a similar fashion to sort of aerial photogrammetry, or do you work with that kind of data generation process?
Let's say the example you saw in the slides is in principle the work of colleagues from, I'm collaborating in Brazil, in Salvador. And they use drone images to update the deprived urban areas, because this last census is from 2010 and it's totally outdated. And they use the boundaries of buildings and also the information they can extract about the height information from buildings to estimate building volumes, and via building volumes to be able to generate more updated population data of areas. Also, a work of my colleague Caroline Gevaert from ITC. She has been doing a lot of mapping with drone images in Kigali, really producing updated building level, but also land use level information in the city of Kigali on deprived urban areas. And that was very much in the context of upgrading projects, where you really need a very detailed level of information to decide where you would plan a new infrastructure, a new road, etc., where you typically need really detailed level to say, is the visit sufficient to have a road, do some buildings, do they need to be relocated, etc. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, wonderful. No, I think that is indeed sufficient. We probably have about time for one or two more questions, depending. So I think we'll go first with Sean's question, just a little bit more about the building footprints method that you were mentioning, as you touched upon it on your answer here. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're using Google imagery to generate building footprints, or what your approach is there?
That's basically a work my colleague, who is also part of the team, John Wang, is doing. He's massively downloading Google Earth images for cities we are working on, mosaicing them then together and using a very common and standard deep learning architecture, which is UNet, which has been assessed across many urban applications as very promising. And he's training the extraction of building footprints based on a data repository of labeled data of different urban types, which is a global data set, not a local data set, to minimize, let's say that's what we all look into, many of these methods to look into minimal user interaction, minimal cost, minimal image cost, because we know that we want to produce data at scale, at larger scale, scalable methods, and at a relatively low cost, because we don't want to, whenever we want to recommend to like a local authority or also national governments, national statistic offices, we don't want to tell them that we have a method which will cost them, I don't know, 1 million euros to purchase commercial images for large areas.
Sure.
So that's basically what we're working on.
Wonderful, thanks. And I think for the last question, I actually think I'm going to exercise a bit of a chair's privilege and ask the question about ethics. In order to preserve the people that are, the vulnerable people's privacy in the areas that you work, do you have any kind of like user access restrictions or processes in place after doing the work to make sure that the privacy and safety of the vulnerable are protected?
It's a good question, and it's very frankly something which is still under development, particularly within IdeaMap, where we are just really at the start of building this data ecosystem. What we see is that we really need this interaction with local communities. We need like having really like an ethic sort of control in this process. We built this data ecosystem from local communities. And we also observe like some work we did recently. One of my students, Maxwell, he has been working in Accra, and there he observed also this very particular situation that local communities of quite settled and older slums have less of a problem. So they actually want even to be on maps, because they're often not on maps, because let's say, being also recognized is also what I hear very strongly from contacts in Lagos, that this level of being recognized, being part of the official city, because they're often just not seen being part of the city. These areas are not an anomaly. That's where like the majority of the population in many cities live, and it's reality. So we have to account for this reality, and we have to bring them to the city and to provide basic services to improve the living conditions. And for this, really base information are fundamental. But there's also this big fear, and that's what we observed in Accra, that for the just building slums, which are like very temporary, just new slums, people are really afraid of being seen on maps, because they're afraid of being immediately evicted. And that's something which really needs to be looked into the local context. And therefore, we also think that gridded systems, at least because they're so tiny, that at least in most of the maps we produce, they're even not seen, because they're too small to be mapped. Whether this is now good or bad is another question. But in this case, we saw that this is actually a good situation.
Cool, thanks. No, that was an excellent answer. The last question comes from MNZ. Seems to be a crowd favorite. Have you been able to translate this data that you've generated into spatial models for blocks or street networks for spatial analysis? Or is this approach more about sort of mapping land use and identifying informal areas?
So let's say about the aggregation unit, that's something which we also have this dual tests where we say, okay, we work with street blocks, but we also see often that the street blocks are often very poor. And again, to the question about open street map data, etc., street level data are often not so are mostly okay globally, but often also in poor urban areas and particularly in peri-urban areas, often not fully covered. And therefore, this aggregation level has issues. And what we want to produce is basically is not a binary system saying this is deprived, non-deprived, but really information layers feeding into various dimensions of deprivation, ranging from really physical dimension, but also adding it with information about service conditions, etc., coming from other data sources to really fill and have a rich data set. So not only like a final product saying one map saying slum, non-slum. And I've seen one question about open, about Google Earth images, open access. That's something which is a bit being very honest. You can download them. I think for research purpose, it's also okay to download them. But of course, there's some copyright restrictions in it. I'm not a legal person.
Well, no matter, I'm sure your comment is very appreciated. So we're at time now. So we're very grateful for your wonderful talk, and we're really glad that we got any and all kind of technological issues taken care of. If any of these questions you'd like to answer remotely, please definitely get in contact with the speaker. I'd also like to put in the chat to all that our YouTube channel will be updated with all recordings of these talks, as well as our next talk by Anna Monroy on the extrapolating and predicting the cost of schooling in future human settlements. So we really appreciate everybody attending. The recordings will be posted as soon as I can get them, edited and processed. And then, yeah, we'll have the next event in 2 weeks' time from Anna Monroy. So thank you very much for attending all, and have a wonderful evening and or day, depending on where you are.